Director of Recreation for the Southern York County Regional Recreation Commission, which includes Shrewsbury Township and New Freedom Borough. We are a new organization. We just started last spring, so we're coming up on 1 year. And as you all saw when you were coming in, we have all kinds of great things going on right now. Lots of flyers on the back table for people of all ages, all the way from preschoolers up to seniors, and events for the whole family. So please check out all the cool things we have going on. Our speaker series is once a month. We have next month is Chuck Cusimano, who is a local New Freedom resident who has overcome some really significant medical challenges and learned to live with some really severe disabilities and really just thrived. And he wants to share his story with the community. So he'll be out here next month. The following month we have Jerry Jones speaking on the geology of York County. He's always really interesting as well. And we will continue every month on and through the summer and fall. So definitely check that out. There's a schedule on the back table. A couple other things we have coming up. There's an adult Easter egg hunt. So if you're, getting jealous when you watch all the kids hunt for eggs, now's your chance out at Miller Park here in a couple of weeks. The eggs all have tickets in them, and you get your tickets and you put them in drawings to win gift baskets with local wine and lottery tickets and other things adults might like more than chocolate bunnies and that type of thing. And also the other one I wanted to speak about really quick is our summer playground program over at Marge Goodfellow Park in New Freedom. That's Monday through Thursday, full day program. So any kids in the area that are looking for someplace to be over the summer, it's a very affordable program. So if you have any neighbors, grandkids, kids, anything like that, check that out. That's all I have to say. So without further ado, Reverend Sterling Fritz. Oh, I have one more thing. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
This microphone I'm holding in my hand. We are being streamed live on the internet. So currently, the whole wide world can watch what's going on in this room, and it'll also be recorded so that people can watch it in the future. And the Reverend has a mic on so they can hear him. But when you speak and have comments and questions, if you don't speak into the microphone, they can't hear you. So if you want to say something, you raise your hand. I'll run over and give you the microphone really quick. And then you can be on the internet too. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Good evening. Nice to see you all here, and I've reconnected with somebody I hadn't seen for probably, 25 years or 30, that we used to work together, and a gentleman that we grew up together. Our dads went to school together, as you'll see in the one picture, and it's nice to be back in Shrewsbury Township. I grew up right over the border in Cadorus Township out by Bon Air. If you know where that's at, off 851, and the creek that divided Shrewsbury and Cadorus Township ran through my grandfather's farms, Deer Creek up by Birthday Club Road, if you know where that's at. And so I live in Hanover now, north of McSherrystown. I was a pastor for 22 years. I retired in September, and I've always loved local history and genealogy. I started doing genealogy in high school, and then as I did genealogy and did research, I realized that I was becoming a local historian. And so I've been putting together presentations and things the last couple of years, and that's what I want to do in retirement, is work on presentations, and I hope to be back maybe in the summer or fall here with some other presentations. I was doing research in the 90s and 80s a good bit because I worked in York. I could go to the Historical Society before I went into work, and I was going through some papers. I'm like, well, I read that again. I didn't realize I had done it 40 years ago. It's part of it, but overall, it's really rich. So tonight we're going to talk about life in 19th century Shrewsbury Township, but I'm going to start off first with this map. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this map before or not. It's called the Skulls map. You can't shine the light, but anyway, down at the bottom. And the thing that you have to remember, I don't want to walk away from the camera, but is that York County, when it was formed in 1741 out of Lancaster County, it included Adams County, which took it all the way over to Hamilton Bend and Fairfield and that area. And we'll see about how that divided. But it's this picture, the reason I'm showing you this map is because I want to do a shout out. How many of you are familiar with the new York County History Center? I don't know if you've been able to be up to it yet. I have not got over to it, but I used to volunteer at the one on Market Street and do things like that. But since I live in Adams County, I have to tell you about Adams County has a new history center, a historical center. If you go to the square or the circle in Gettysburg and head up Biglerville Road, you can't miss it. It's right on the right-hand side. And my wife and I volunteered there for a few months. But if you're over that way, it's like $15 for non-residents, but it's well worth it. The centerpiece of that museum is the Beyond the Battle, or Caught in the Crossfire, excuse me. It's called Beyond the Battle because it covers 300 plus years of Adams County history, but it also it has a recreation of a Civil War frame house that would have been in Gettysburg, and you go into it, and they have sound effects and everything like that. You feel like they're fighting outside all around you. Sometimes they warn people, we warn people that if they have PSD or any things, they don't want to do it, but it's pretty good. So, and the reason I talk to you about that is because that has a Glen Rock connection. There you go. I didn't change my picture. There's what it looks like. It's a brick house part that looks like a house from the Civil War period, and then the rest of the museum. They have a nice area upstairs where they have programs. They have a YouTube channel that if you're into Civil War history, every Monday they have Monuments Monday. That Tim Smith, who is their historian, talks about monuments on the battlefield. And this gentleman here, Dr. Charles Gladfelder, is a person from Shrewsbury Township, actually Glen Rock. And anybody that does local history in this area owes a debt to this man, because he started doing things back in the 40s when he went to Gettysburg College, and he has a lot of things. He's published books and everything like that. But he also, when he lived in Gettysburg and taught at the college, he started the Adams County Historical Society, and now the archive room there is named after him. So I always like to share that. In fact, and he's back in Shrewsbury Township, Glen Rock, because he's buried in Glen Rock in the cemetery. So I always like to acknowledge the debt that we owe to him for what he has done. And one of the people that was sort of a person that got to know him and had help with this was a minister out at Stelz's church in the 80s, and he did land grants of the early properties in Shrewsbury Township, and this is just one section. And Neil Hively did these, and what it was, the process was you asked for a land grant, and then you had them come out and they would make a warrant, and then eventually you would get a deed. That didn't happen until the 19th century in many cases, and that's when you actually had to pay for the land, or it depends on what's what. But this area here that I'm showing, if you see down at the bottom in the middle, Frederick Fissel, does that name sound familiar to anyone? Fissel's Church. So this is like right at Fissel's Church. And then there's Marymount, the Kleinfelders. That's some of my ancestors, and they were very, very important in the early history of Shrewsbury Township. And so I have a whole other program on that, which I could do sometime for you. So anyway, that's where they were located. And one of their descendants in the 60s, he came up with a map that shows where their land grants actually covered, and the map next to it is a more modern map. But basically, if you stood in front of Susquehannock High School and looked this way and this way and this way, pretty much as far as you could see, that was all owned by the Kleinfelder family. And up into the rental farm, and that's where down here, down at the bottom it says Confederate soldiers were seen here in 1863. That's up on the ridge above the rental farm going up the hollow that we're going to be talking about here shortly. And then, but it's amazing, and he was very wealthy for his day. And we know this because in, let me get my map caught up here. In 1792, they needed to pay off some of the debt from the Revolutionary War, so they started the first tax. And it was a direct tax, and it's sometimes called the glass tax because some municipalities figured out that the best way to know who the rich people were is they had glass in their log cabins. And so they actually, you can see here, this is not what the original document, somebody transcribed all the original data into spreadsheets, and it's available at the Historical Society. And you can see that the Kleinfelders, according, if you look at some of the individual numbers and the amount of buildings and everything, and most of those were over right outside of where the schools sit over at Susquehannock, going over towards Country Club Road, going down towards the arches. If you know what I'm talking about, there's two arches between Railroad and all in that area. And so the Kleinfelders actually then also belonged to Fissel's church, which we'll hear about shortly, but they kind of broke apart from that because they became evangelicals. It was a new evangelical church started by Jacob Albright, and they broke away. And supposedly the story goes that this John Kleinfelder's wife died, and they wouldn't bury her at Fissel's church because they had left the church. I don't know that that's totally true, but they started a family cemetery on the family farm, and this lies right behind Southern Middle School. Any of you know where it's at? Yeah, right up behind us. I had asked one of the teachers when I was in middle school, why do we have a cemetery near the tennis courts? And he said, it's to bury the smart kids that ask too many questions. If you went to middle school, I'll tell you who the teacher was. He's gone now. But anyway, and we're going to see the one guy here, Michael Kleinfelder Smith, or Kleinfelder cites his tombstone. But John Kleinfelder and his son, John Jacob Kleinfelder, they were some of the first burials in that cemetery. And now I'm going to go to, so they actually had up on that hill there where the cemetery is, there was actually a chapel, was built in 1860. But by 1890, they no longer needed it. It didn't take off. There were actually some evangelical churches. One of them right up the road here in Potosi was a pretty good size evangelical church. And so they moved the band hall, a group called the Patriotic Sons of America. They still exist. They bought the building and moved it to Bon Air, right in the heart of Bon Air. And it became later Stoner's Auction. How many of you ever went to Stoner's Auction in Bon Air? That was the building that burned down, was the original Kleinfelder Chapel. And we know this because there's pictures of the chapel here. And I actually came into possession of these through a line of my family. This is the original of what you see up on the screen. It's the Bon Air Band. There must have been enough people around Bon Air to have a band. And that's something to talk about too, is that most of the communities here had bands, and most people played an instrument back in the 19th century. Why? No radio, no TV. You had to make your own entertainment. And so, I mean, that's why they had a band. But this building, like I said, was also, at one time, was used as a school, and also then Fissel's Church, the women's group, bought it in the early 20th century. They had socials there, and then when they built their new educational building in 1957, they sold it to, I don't know, Stoner bought it next, or who did, but and then it burned down in the early 90s, I believe. So back to these land grants, and this is a little bit different one. But what I want to show you on here, this pretty much covers most of Shrewsbury Township. Over there where you see Deer Valley, that's the current place where Glen Rock's at. And you go down and you see Frederick Fissel and John Kleinfelder up in your, should be your left-hand corner. Yeah, there you go, thank you. And that's up, and then up on top, that other green one, it's called Hungry Hall. I think that's a misprint. It's going to be Hungry Hill. We'll hear about that. That's coming up through the hollow going toward Shrewsbury. That line on the far right is the pike, so to speak. That's the 111 right out here. It's the original roadway that came up from Baltimore and Maryland into Pennsylvania. And down in the bottom here, I know last month you can't quite see it, but that Peter Hendricks, Peter's level, and then there's another one next that's kind of cut off. I know Jim McClure last month talked about the Blue Ball Tavern. And that area, that's where that area is at. And then you get over here too far, then you're over in Cadorus Township. The Emspackers were in Cadorus Township. But then even up, like I say, it's pretty much the central part going towards the west of Shrewsbury Township. And if you ever wondered, if you've moved here, why is the high school where it's at? Or why are the schools where they're at? Out in the middle of nowhere, it seems like, right? But if you look at a map of Cadorus and Shrewsbury Township, and you pick the exact center from all parts of both townships, that's where it's at. That is the exact center. So that's what they did back in the 40s and early 50s when they consolidated. They wanted to try to make it as centrally located as they could. So that's what they came up with. And then another thing, this was one of the early churches in Shrewsbury Township, was Fissel's Church, and that's my home church, is where I grew up. And many of my ancestors are buried there for generations. And they started out, and most churches did back in that day, as a log church. That's what most of the buildings were. In the 18th century, everything was built as a log building. And then some of the stone houses you see in that area and also in Shrewsbury Township were built maybe at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century as people became more affluent and also had more time. When they were developing this and settling this area, you got to have a building. In fact, I saw something the other day that they would start cutting the trees in the spring, and by fall when it got cold, they hope to have a cabin up, and at least a single cabin that they could winter in, and then the next year they might add an addition on or put some more pieces on. This is interesting. Somebody just posted this the other day. There's a house, they've taken away the framework and everything, up in Godores Township that is still an 1800 original log cabin that people live in. And my parents' home, the center of it, is a log cabin from like 1812. So that's what they had, and that's when the church deed was given for Fissel's. And the first was a log cabin. And then in 1851, there's a lot of transformation right around the middle of the 19th century. People were becoming a little more affluent. People have a little more money. And so they decided they needed a new church. So they built a 2-story brick church, and it had a balcony. I know what it looks like inside, and I'll show you in a minute why. They had a balcony around 3 sides, and if you look up in the window up in the front of the church, you might see a figure in the window. Yeah, right there. And so this would have probably been to the right of where the current cemetery is, kind of where there's a little brick house there with the outdoor toilets. Probably was in that section there. But, excuse me, but they moved stones sometime in the early 20th century. They were all in bad repair. They actually moved stones, poured concrete, and set all the old stones in concrete. So they're not probably placed where the people were originally buried. But anyway, and then the ridge behind there, if you would look up right behind that right now, that's where the schools sit, up on the hill there. And that ridge that the school district sits on runs all the way from there all the way out to Manchester, Maryland. If you've ever driven out Limeboro Road or Glenville Road, you know, it's like a ridge. That's a geographic feature that I think is really cool in this area. Well, now, excuse me, we're going to look at church because that's sort of the background, but also Lewis Miller, we'll hear more about him in a minute, was an itinerant artist right at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, and so he drew pictures of everyday life. And here we have the one on your left is of the Christ Lutheran Church in York. And it looks like a pretty busy Sunday morning. I mean, you got people running, the dogs running around in there and different things like that. And then over there on the right, on the center is a pastor is trying to preach and everything else is going on. I'm sure it was like pandemonium. And then over here you have this music master that was teaching the kids about music and singing. But one of the reasons I put this up to compare, if you look at this picture, look at the men. Most of the men have shorts, or well, I forget what they call them, but they had breeches. They wore breeches and silk stockings. And we're going to see a change in that as we go into more into the 18th century, 19th century. This is a better drawing of what a wine glass pulpit looks like. Why do you think they had a pulpit up on a wall like that with a thing over top of it in the churches years ago? It's amplification. I got to test that out in a church down over in Montgomery County, or right on the border with Berks County. There's still a lot of really old, it was an 1801 church, and you go up the steps and when you're talking, it kind of bounces off the top of that wood piece and goes out into, but they were not huge buildings either. They were probably, most of them, in fact the one it's not much bigger than this room. And so and the church was one of the main social things that people did in that time period. St. Louis Miller he was a Pennsylvania Dutch folk artist. He's noted for his watercolors of historical and everyday events. He was born in 1796, and by the time he was 14 years old, he drew this picture at a neighbor's farm in 1810. And if you notice, all the men have long pants on now. They're moving away from the breeches and things. But also, that is a typical farmstead, probably what it looked like, all log buildings. And if you see there, 9 out of 10 families made their living from the land. Typical farm, 100 to 200 acres, but only about 20 acres of that was cultivated because they couldn't handle much more than that. And then all hands helped in some way with very basic tools. Clothing, mostly homemade. Diet consisted of smoked items, pickled items, dried items, and items that keep in a ground cellar. You didn't have refrigeration, so you either had to dry it, smoke it, or do pickle it to keep it. And that's why a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch dishes are big on pickles and pickling, because that's sort of the heritage. And then special occasions were church, house, and barn raisins, harvest husking parties, and special meetings and things like that. And then another important part of the culture was taverns. And right down the road here, I believe the Coulter House in that area, there was probably a tavern there back in the 18th century, I believe. And possibly north of us here was a tavern as well. But this is fascinating. Women could not manage their own property unless it was a tavern. Why do you think that was? Because they were the ones that usually did all the work, maybe, but also because they didn't want the taverns to go out of business when the man died. They were so important. They were the community hub. Plus, also, the water wasn't always the best. You needed to drink something that, actually, if you were sick, maybe it would cure you, And there's some familiar Southern York County names that had taverns. Earhart's, Hendricks, which is the ones that were down at Blue Ball Inn, down at the southeast end of the township. The Kleinfelders, John and Peter, which I believe that one may have been around somewhere around Glen Rock or somewhere. Peterman, we're going to hear more about him in a minute, and Yost. And that's what they looked like. It was a lot of hard work. I mean, they had a big hearth to cook on. And if you want to see what one of those looks like, that stove that she's working on, out at Old Bedford Village, out in Bedford, Pennsylvania, they have a lot of old buildings, and they have one that has a thing. It's really kind of cool. They built a fire underneath, and they have like a flat stone, and it's like having a griddle. They can make everything on top of that. And so this is Lewis Miller. He made his living as a carpenter and did a little bit of all kind of stuff. This is kind of like an advertisement for him about all the things he did. And then he had a friend, Mr. Bacon, who was an attorney. And again, you can see both of them in the 18 teens and 20s are wearing long pants. So that's a clothing change. Women pretty much were still wearing the same things they wore in the 18th century. And now we have another map. And this map is the Small and Wagner map, which is the next one that really was popular, that people might have had copies of in this area. It's from 1821. And if you look down where it says Shrewsbury Township, and maybe you can pull that with your cursor there, it looks awful big. If you look at it, right there and go up, Shrewsbury Township, and the Cadorus is over on the other side of that pink line, but anyway, it included Springfield Township. So it would have went all the way up to York Township, and I don't know what other one it would have touched on in the west end. But we'll see what happened that changed. But let's talk about, first of all, some of the major changes that there was an impetus to change things. And it was, first of all, citizens wanted more political structure for public works, but still locally controlled as much as possible. For example, one of the reasons that Adams County separated from York County in 1800 was, if you can imagine, if you've ever been out this way, is, the county seat is in York. The people in Adams County, Fairfield, out 116. Can you imagine riding a horse from there to York? It was probably at least a day and a half journey, maybe 2 days to get here. So they asked if they could become their own county, and that's what a lot of it was, because of the distances involved. And that was when it was early, as you can see from some of the dates in a few minutes, But in the meantime, also transportations. In the early 19th century, even nationwide, there was two schools of thought about infrastructure, we call it nowadays, but improvements. In other words, what can we do to improve people's lives? Can we build bridges? Can we build roadways? Can we build canals? Can we build railroads? And improve how people get stuff to market, how people can be connected. Also communication. The rural free delivery and some of the mail systems started in that time period as well. And so that was something. And then the telegraph came along in 1844, and that really transformed things almost as much as the internet has in our day. And so it was a way for people, even if they moved out west, they still might be able to stay connected with families, or at least send important news just in a simple message, somebody has died, or also, whatever they wanted to share. And then we have public education. 1834 Free School Act passed, and by 1886 all schools in Shrewsbury Township were public schools. Before that, if there were schools, it was either what we call nowadays homeschooling, or you did have some of the pastors in the area might have had some type of educational component at the church or at the log house where they taught children at least to read and write. Then agricultural as well. There were improvements in equipment, seed and fertilization, particularly with the plow, John Deere and the plow, and McCormick and the reaper, but also in our area in Seitzlin was a big fertilizer plant. And that worked out nice because the farmers didn't have to worry when their animals died about what to do with the bodies, because they could take them down to Seitzlin and they would take care of cooking them down to bone, and then that helped enrich the farmland too, so it was a win-win. Industrial, large and small businesses able to receive raw materials and ship their products over a wider area than before. That's where the railroads and the canals came in. And then the family life, more social time and travel, also increased ability to stay connected with distant relatives. So people, they still had to work hard, and they were working hard every day, but they had some time. Now that they didn't have to worry about rebuilding the house every year or doing things like that, they could sort of become able to share in more things in their community. So here's a transformation in York County from 1830 to 1860. The townships began to subdivide, and I'm not going to try to have another thing that's a little more explains better, but as you can see, that's when Springfield broke apart from Shrewsbury in 1835. Cadorah split in two in 1838. Over in Manheim Township by Cadorah State Park, and Penn Township, actually it was Penn Township was all four of those, and then it broke into Heidelberg, or Penn broke off from Heidelberg, and then West Manheim and Manheim, and just all over the place. And even the early Shrewsbury Township originally included all of Hopewell too, all the three of the Hopewell townships now. So that would have been in the early 1700s that that was one big township. And then here you can see that over a period of about 50 years, 14 original townships became 36 townships. And nothing much has changed since then. Because here's a map of what we have now, and I didn't bother counting them, but that's our current political infrastructure in York County with the towns and with the municipalities, the townships, and things like that. This is a little later, this is 1870, but one thing that's really helpful in this area, including Shrewsbury Township, in 1867 or 70, they started a newspaper in Glen Rock called the Glen Rock Item, and you can actually find that online now. They've scanned it. It's through newspapers.com. It's not cheap, but you can search it and do things. Before you had to go look at microfilm and on microfilm. But anyway, I found this article, and it probably was written by a distant relative of mine because he was the public editor and publisher of the thing, but it talks about improvements that they're excited about seeing that they want to continue. The York Peach Bottom Turnpike running from York to Susquehanna, a turnpike built from Shrewsbury to North Central Railroad, which will be of great value to the borough. The construction of a railroad from New Freedom into Bachman's Valley, which is down across the border into Maryland, going over towards Manchester and Limeburg. So they were, again, it's more connection. And this is the person that's really, I always said out west when they were talking about building towns and stuff, they had people they called boosters. And we had boosters in our area too. They were people that had a vision that we could change things and make it better for everybody and try to improve things so that we didn't have to live the way we did 20 years ago. And, some people were resistant to that, but others were like, yeah, I would like that to happen. Now the canals, York County, the only canal we had that we were close to was the Susquehanna Canal that went up from the Maryland border there and went up along the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. And there's still remnants of that. Every once in a while some people put on pictures that they go down and walk down along the river, and when the river's a little bit lower, they can see them. And when I lived in Reading, there was the Union Canal, which was on the Schuylkill, and there were still parts of that standing as well, or the locks were still in place. And that one was used till 1939, that people would be able to go right down from where the church I served, get on a canal and go up to Reading on the canal, because the roadway wasn't that great from that area to Reading. And then there's a part of York County history that has something to do with the river, is a guy named John Elger built the first iron steamboat, the Codorus. Then he put in the water over at the Accomack, and he actually drove it, or powered it all the way up the Susquehanna, up to the headwaters of the Susquehanna, which are up by us. It's where the baseball museum, Cooperstown, is. And but it wasn't profitable. It didn't really take off, so it ended up. But one of the guys that helped building the engine was Phineas Davis. And there's a picture of him by Lewis Miller. And so this is a map from 1836. And remember the 1870 map? It didn't look like too much going on. Now we can see how rapidly changing the world is in just about 30 or 66 years between those two maps. We have all these connections, all these railroads, and it actually down at the bottom, it gives you times for the railroad schedule. Like if you want to go from York to Lancaster or wherever the connections are, you can basically do them in half a day now, or maybe not even that long. And the first engine, anthracite coal-burning engine, was called the York because Phineas Davis developed it. So that was one of the first engines they used on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1825, or around that time period. And then now we have steam into history. And most of these pictures, I think, are taken by my second cousin, Mike Thomas. He takes a lot of pictures for the railroad. And anyway, I love this. The old engine is really cool. And he has some great shots of it going over bridges and being in New Freedom. And then the railroad became really critical during this American Civil War. I'm kind of getting out of sequence, but it fit better to go with this. You can see there the North Central Railroad came up from Baltimore and up through Shrewsbury, Railroad, New Freedom, Glen Rock. And then you had up at Hanover Junction, it connected with the Western Maryland Railroad. And because you had to switch trains, Hanover Junction was a very critical point in controlling messaging and things with the with message telegraph and things. And that's why the Confederates went and broke up the telegraph lines at Hanover Junction to cut off Washington from knowing what the Army was doing in 1863. And so, but they got things back up pretty quickly, and those are the same railways that President Lincoln rode to come up to Gettysburg in November of 1863 to deliver the Gettysburg Address. And every November they have Dedication Day. And I'm learning a lot since I live in Adams County. They have Dedication Day. It's usually November 19th, which is the anniversary. Depends when it falls, but they have ceremony and special speakers in the National Cemetery, and they also have a parade of reenactors and different things like that. So this area was pretty impacted, particularly with Lee's invasion that came up to Gettysburg. And I don't know if any of you have been up on the rail trail up by Gladfelder Station or in that area. There's a tunnel up there. It's the second oldest tunnel, Howard Tunnel. When I was very small, my parents lived on a farm right across the creek from where that is, up by York, New Salem, and north of Seven Valleys. This is not an old picture. This is a reenactment that's colorized, but I still think that's cool. And actually, what's interesting, the tunnel that's the older one than this is still in existence, and they're trying to figure out a way to go around it. They still have trains going through it every day down around outside of D.C., and they want to build around it because they want to be able to carry higher loads on the trailers now. And there is Hanover Junction, which I'm glad it's been preserved, and a lot of the railroad tracks close to that were washed out in Agnes in 1972. That whole valley was basically flooded out. And then in the early 20th century or late 19th century, you could go pretty much anywhere in south central Pennsylvania, either by railroad or trolley, and get to a lot of places that now you have to drive to. Like in this case here, it shows you that there was even a trolley rail line all the way from up in Wagglestown and up 74 all the way down to Littlestown and McSherrystown. And then there was another, the railroad ran out to New Oxford and Gettysburg, and then the other one came up. There was a branch that came up from Hampstead and up that way. So people were very much connected, and there was a lot of commerce that happened on those railroads because of the connections as far as shipping goods and things like that. And then you have Glen Rock probably had the fanciest station, I guess, back in the day. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember it being there or not. They tore it down the year I was born, so I don't remember it. But it looks so huge compared to what the space is where supposedly it's set. This is a modern picture down there on the right-hand side, taken at about the same angle that the picture up above was taken. And that hotel that's in the picture up above is where Geipel's is at now. The building, they tore that building and a couple houses down to build the Geipel's furniture store. But that one over here on the bottom left, I think is a cool picture because it really shows they had like 3 or 4 lines. They had a cattle pen. There was a loading dock there. There was a grocery store in it right after it got built. And probably most of the time it was the mail office too for Glen Rock and some of the community. And then Shrewsbury Station on the right, we know is railroad, right? Why did they, let's show a little bit, why do you think they built a, had to run a station, excuse me, in railroad rather than Shrewsbury? The reason, huh?
Follow the contour of the river.
Well, that and also the rise. Shrewsbury at the highest point is 600 feet above sea level. Glen Rock's about 400 feet. New Freedom's about maybe, I think, 300 feet or something like that. That it would have been such a pitch to try to get up to that area. That's why they kind of avoided it. And we know that when you drive on the old trail, you know that when you come up from Shrewsbury, or in Shrewsbury, it's kind of, and particularly I was blown away recently because I was away from the area. Up on the hill there where Walmart and stuff is, and you go on the other side where Panera and stuff is, you can see for miles. But I mean, that shows you that the elevation up in that part of the topography is much higher than what it is in the other areas. When I did this for another group, somebody said, oh, this is where the one on the left in New Freedom, that's where the train stopped at Pisano's so you could get pizza. That is the building, I think, that still is there. And and then they had another one a little further down the line, which is also, restored, that the Steam into History does. And now I want to just step back a step. This is something you can see at the Adams County thing. But a lot of things, one of the coolest things for me that happened in the 19th century is photography. Because before that, the only way you had a family member preserved was a painting. And who could afford to have a painting done of a family member? Very few people. You often see the silhouettes. Did you ever see like the little silhouettes that they could have? That were itinerant. People went around and would kind of draw their face and then cut out a silhouette. But starting in 1826, they started developing photography. And then in 1854, they patented the ambrotype. And then I want to show you one of those. I'm not going to pass this around, but I am going to pass around some of the other types. And I'd like them back if you would. But at least you can see them. This is an ambrotype. And this gentleman I'm going to be talking about in a few more minutes. I don't know if it can show up on the camera or not, but it's in a little compact case. Did any of you ever see ones like this? Because it's printed on glass. It's developed on glass. And you see how rosy his cheeks are? What they would do is after they developed it, they would paint the cheeks of the people. And this is a great-great-uncle of mine, who I'll talk about in a minute. And then this is his younger brother, which was my third great-grandfather, or second great-grandfather, I guess, yeah. And this, he wasn't as valued as the older brother, I guess. They got a small one of him. But anyway, this one's just the pure, like, regular daguerreotype is what they call these. It's a, what's that?
What year is that?
This one I'm judging to be about 1857. He was born in 1842, and I figure he was about 15 in that picture. I don't know who got to it. Somebody scratched on the glass or whatever, so that is, that's what those look like. And then we get to carte de vis, which are these. Now, a lot of them are bigger. Nope, there they all go. I don't know if I can get down there and get it, but you're younger, Gina. You're a recreational person. Can you get? Yeah, I have no idea who these people are, but at least it gives you a thing of what. Thank you so much. Now I'll start those on that side, and I'll start these over here. These are tin types. They're printed on tin, and if you want to look at those and pass those back, here's some more. Now I just read the other week something, and here's a picture of the Kleinfelder Chapel when it was used as a school in Bon Air. There's a class, and there's some of my relatives in that picture. But these, if you ever see, this is from like 1870s to 1900, a carte de vis, and see how it's like a frame around this woman and black flowers and things. I believe that this woman had died. They actually, they're memorial cards. And so if you see that, again, no name on the back, but it was published by another branch of my family with a photographer in Glen Rock in the 1887 area, Louis Yost. And if your families have been here and they had photos taken by him, you would see that.
What was the name of that? What type of photo was that?
These that are printed on cardboard are called carte de vis. They were printed on cardboard, and they were the really most popular because they were affordable. Oh, there's the daguerreotype down here in the bottom. You see it's black and white, whereas the amber type have a little bit of color in. The color type I'm not familiar with. The tin type is basically they printed on tin. And then, actually, any of you ever been to Antietam? Battlefield? If you go in the visitor's entrance, you're standing right where those bodies were at, probably. Because the Dunker Church is right across the road, and the angle they shot that. We were just down the other year. Last fall, they redid the visitor center at Antietam, but unfortunately they had a problem with humidity and stuff, so they have no artifacts there right now. So I want to get back down sometime. But we walked the battlefield a little bit at that time, and it's interesting to have that kind of history here. I understand if you went back to the office here, here's the map. There was a guy named Shearer. They said he was about half, they thought he was a little loony, but he traveled around York County with a wheelbarrow with his instruments and drawing things on in the 1850s, late 50s, and he created this map. And it was published quite extensively, and it actually was still many copies are around. Worley sold one a couple weeks ago. They have one here at the township. The one on the right is not, it's another copy, but our family, the Secrets family, which I'm going to get to here in a minute, owned an original copy, and I know why, which I'll tell you why in a minute. And it's now, if you've ever been to the Shrewsbury Paul Smith Library in the room back in the back, that was donated by my great uncle on behalf of our family. And that makes me feel proud, and that's what I'd like to do too with some of the things that we have that have been preserved in the family. And okay, now we'll get into a particular family in Shrewsbury Township in the 19th century. And it's my third great-grandparents, Henry, and he was married to Mary Kleinfelder. There's where the Kleinfelders come in. And then she died, and he married a Stambaugh. Did not have any children with her. And then his son, Henry K. Sechrist, was my second great-grandfather, and he married Elizabeth Strayer. And then Charles Sechrist married Minerva Jones, and they were my great-grandparents. And I knew both of them. They died when I was like 4 and 5, but I do remember them. And so that's why it's always been kind of, as I think back now at my age, I'm 65, soon to be 66. My story, my grandmother Margaret, who was their daughter, one day we were talking about something, and she said, yes, she said, and you'll meet her in a little bit, Elizabeth Strayer, lived to 1920. And my grandmother was born in 1911. And somehow they got to talking about the guns at the Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg. And her grandmother Elizabeth said, we heard thunder on the 3rd day of July, and we thought it was thunder, and we realized now, later we realized it was the Battle of the Cannonade at Gettysburg. And so I just sat there and thought, I'm talking to somebody who talked to somebody who heard the guns at Gettysburg. I'm getting the chills now just thinking about that. But we are closer to history than we realized. But also back in that time period, it was popular, and particularly maybe she did this right after she got married. In fact, I think I know that that's what she did. 1837 is about the time she would have got married to my great-grandfather. It's a sampler, and that's still in the family, and it's still in pretty good condition. So that is something that was preserved. So anyway, we were down here at Fissel's Church and Kleinfelder and Mary, and then we go up towards Seitzlin. It doesn't show, but remember that Hungry Hill or Hungry Hall? I said it's Hungry Hill. And the reason it's called Hungry Hill, if you know the road I'm talking about, it comes up past Runnels and winds up, and it starts down at what was a mill, and I'm going to show a picture of that, and it goes up to Shrewsbury because of the increase in elevation. The story that I heard from my uncles and great uncles was that if you had a horse and buggy and you started at the bottom of that hill down at the mill and got up to about the midway point up towards Shrewsbury, the horse was tired. You had to pull over in the field and feed the horse or give him water. Because I tried to ride it one time on my bike when I was staying at my grandparents' and about killed myself. But anyway, it really is a sharp incline. So anyway, that's what we're going to be getting into now. We're going to go up the valley, so to speak, up to Toad Valley is what they called it. But I'm going to jump back a minute. Any of you ever seen these? Fractors is what they're called. And actually, let me get down here. I made some notes on this. They're part of a Pennsylvania German culture, and they used them for baptisms and birth certificates in the Lutheran Reformed faith, and they also used by Anabaptists, the Amish, the Brethren, Mennonites, and so forth. And they're called Tofscheins or Geburtsuntofscheins, birth certificate. And then marriage certificates were Traufscheins, and they were used to document marriages. We have some of these in my family for some of the people I've been talking about, but I don't know who has them. I didn't get a chance to take pictures of them. But I always thought they're kind of cool. And I was at a history thing out in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, and some other places you can go where they have like drawers that you can pull out, and they're under glass, and you can just look at so many different designs. But this Daniel Peterman, you remember when we saw the taverns? He was the tavern, and then his son Daniel was kind of in Cadorus Township, but he did part of his living, besides farming, was making these certificates up for people. And there are a lot of them floating around. Some of them are more valuable than others, depends on the condition, and also if somebody from the family wants it. Okay, now this is the connection I was telling about with Shrewsbury Township. The Henry Sechrist that I've told about happened to be a supervisor for Shrewsbury Township in 1860. And he kept a book. He went around and collected the road tax for all the neighbors. And it came down through the family. And I hope to maybe one day, I was telling them, I'll probably leave it to the township because I think it's an important part of township history. But it's amazing that it survived. but anyway, he went around and he collected in 1860 1,300 hours. It was equal to about $48,000 in today's money. And then I forgot about this in the back here. What he did is he would actually hire people to do different projects for the road. And see here if I can find it. Yeah. Here's one, he's paying some guy to haul stones. Like some of them could work off the tax by providing materials. So, I mean, that was what they did. But I want to transcribe this and list all the names and share it, actually not just with the township, but online and stuff so people can see it. But he was, I don't have a picture of Henry, unfortunately, to show you. But anyway, this is in 1882. So that was 1860. This is 22 years later. And he's now the treasurer. And maybe he was the treasurer before of Shrewsbury Township. And he died in 1890. And then his son, my great-grandfather, married a Strayer. And Nathaniel at the top that I painted in green, that's him sitting there looking pretty prosperous. And he was the one of the supervisors. There was a Staniford and a Durr, two good. Durrs particularly have been in the area for years. But they were a part of helping maintain the infrastructure of Shrewsbury Township back then. And it was important, the roads particularly. This is cool. Somebody created this. I found this online. That Plank Road is right down the road here, right? How did it get called Plank Road? Because it had a plank. But I don't think it was near as fancy as what they imagined this one was. It was constructed from downtown Lancaster to Mannheim, probably Route 72 now, if you're familiar with Lancaster. And it was 11 miles long, and it was considered a superhighway in that day. They held horse and carriage races because it was so well constructed. The plank road that ran from Shrewsbury to Hopewell was only about 5 miles long, but that was probably difficult to keep up. Most of the time, they wouldn't have had it quite as done like that. Typically, what it was just logs, cut down trees, and then they might put planks over top of it, or just something where they would try to make it a little smoother. It was better than driving in mud. If you can imagine, you know, trying to take a carriage through mud or a wagon. So, and it did tie together almost over, maybe, I don't know how far, but what would have been the main route from Stewartstown, the Red Line, you know, 24, and over here at the trail. So it was something that they did to try to, and that was in the early days of the 19th century. Here's one of the national and world events that impacted people in Shrewsbury Township, is the Civil War. And as I was sharing the story earlier about my grandmother, but anyway, this area was predominantly was Democratic, which was kind of anti-war and didn't really want to fight the South. And so they weren't really jumping to enlist, but a number of people did. And they have people here, according to NC Sites, who I talked about earlier, wrote a history for Gibson's History of York County. And he lists some of the men, as you can see, some familiar names that served. And we're in the 87th Pennsylvania Regiment. And the 87th kind of was like different places. The only the two main battles they were in were at Monocacy, down right near Frederick in 1864, and then also over at Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah Valley in the same time period. And there's a man from Shrewsbury. His dad's name was Noah Rule. He's buried in the cemetery behind the churches. And he served in the Mexican-American War, and then he was in the Civil War, but he wasn't well. But his son Edgar was serving, and he was killed at Cedar Creek. And there was a GAR group after the Civil War in York that was named in his memory. But then later in 1862, they needed more soldiers, so they did a year-long enrollment. And I'm not sure if this is my great-grandfather, Henry B. The dates don't quite match. He would have been 20 in 1862 or 21, but I don't know. They have 22 years old, but it could possibly be him. But what's fascinating to me about it is they were organized in October to December 1862. they moved them to Washington, then to Newport News and Suffolk, Virginia. And they were down in Suffolk, Virginia, and down along the peninsula down there, which I'm going to be down there in about a week and a half in Williamsburg at my sister-in-law's. And we've been getting around to some of those places. But they were down there when their homes were being invaded up here by the Confederates. They're probably, what'd you send me down here for? I want to be home defending my home turf and you're down there. But they really didn't do too much. They just moved around a lot down in the peninsula down there, and then they mustered out at the end of July 1863. So they were home in time to help with the fall harvest, which was a good thing. But it just is, it was kind of like a temporary, almost more like in a quasi-National Guard type capacity. Now here's the people at home can see it now. The pictures I showed earlier, the ambrotype William Kleinfelder Sechrist is on your left, and then Henry, there's two pictures. One of them's a tin type, one of them's the other one. And both of them, I think, the reason I know they were probably taken about 1857 is because of the next slide. During the first half of the 19th century, many younger members of the original settlers of Pennsylvania struggled to find enough land to maintain a successful farm. So they immigrated to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And in cemeteries in these areas, you will see familiar Shrewsbury Township names like Kleinfelder, Seitz, Rule, and Bailey. And William Kleinfelder, the big stocky guy, headed out to Morrow County, Ohio in 1857. He had aunts and uncles out there, so he wasn't going out there alone. And he ended up settling out there. He wrote letters back about how he did not want to fight in the Civil War. He didn't believe in it. And I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. But anyway, I was able to, in 2022, I had a meeting out in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I made my way across Ohio, through Morrow County, up into Richland, right between that area above the yellow, and I found the cemetery where William was buried. And it reminds me that land up in northeast, central Ohio looks very much like around here. Southern Ohio is fairly flat, but northern Ohio has ridges and things, so he probably felt right at home there. But anyway, he wrote letters back, and I have them in my possession. And I want to transcribe those someday too. But he had things like they had stamps. Like up at the top here, the Blue Eagle says, accept the olive branch. In other words, negotiate a peace with the South. Too many men are dying, two people. They were what they call peace Democrats. And they didn't want to fight the war. And also, this was another one, the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of laws. In other words, some of the Democrats were saying that Lincoln was overstepping his bounds and doing things that were not, what he should do. So I'm not sure. He did end up, I think, serving a short term. In the Army. He actually paid some guy to go as a substitute. You know about that in the Civil War? You could pay. The substitute took the $300 and ran. Yeah, so he didn't have a good time with that.
Notice the spelling of Shrewsbury.
Huh?
The spelling of Shrewsbury is with a U, is with an E instead of a U at the end, over there on the right.
Yeah. He was not the most literate guy. I mean, he could write. I'll be honest with you, that's what the hardest part of transcribing the letters. I started a couple years ago. I worked on a master's in history at Millersville in the 90s, and I did, for my major project, I did a couple of his letters. And it took me a day or two just to work through and write down what I thought he had wrote in some of the letters. But yeah, and then it was so funny because some of the letters early on in 1860 and 61 before the war, it was about how horrible it is, and the cow died, and he has no money. He's kind of like hitting up the parents for money. Excuse me, I don't know if they ever sent him any or not. So anyway, now we're going to come back to the valley, and you can see down there again is the Reformed Church, which is Thistles. Michael Seitz, who we're going to see in a minute here, lived right above the church, basically where the middle school is, and going down from the middle school down towards the arches there. There's a farm there on the left. It was the Schweitzer farm. and then Smiths lived there. That was the Kleinfelder, I think, the main farm. And anyway, that's where Michael lived, and then it passed down to his daughter, Lucretia, who was married to one of my great-great-uncles. So there was a lot of connection. But anyway, we're going to go up to the valley there where it's Seitzland, and I just drove that way tonight and came over through. You can either go under the bridge and come out there, or you can go up through and try to weave through the buildings, which is really tight. But we're going to stop along the way at a couple different places. There's a grist mill. We're going to talk about the Snell, and then the Sechrist home place. I mentioned earlier about Michael K. Seitz. I showed you his tombstone in the cemetery. He was a guy that I really admired. He really wanted to see his children educated. And so what they did in 1848, he started a one-room school in Shrewsbury Township in the front rooms of the house that's still standing next to Thistle's Church. Some people think that was a parsonage. It was always the sexton's house, as far as I know and my family knows. We almost rented it, Jeff. One time they had it the church had it for rent, and my wife and I looked at it. It was too rustic. They did modernize it Yeah, they did modernize it since then, but it was basically, it was kind of like we had rented an old farmhouse up near Richard Nixon Park that was brick, and it was not well insulated. In the wintertime, we could go through a 275-gallon oil tank in about 2.5 weeks. So, that's the, yeah. But anyway, but there's the thing I think is cool is there were 175 years of education on that hill, or in that area. And they've preserved the old one-room schoolhouse. And the front facade of Susquehanna doesn't look the same anymore. They've done a remodeling project and changed the original facade. So anyway, then we come up that hollow, and there's a school. It's still standing as a house now, King's School, because the guy that owned the property there was named King. And I can't point it out, but in the back row in the center with the striped shirt, that's my dad. He's still living. And then down in the front here, let me get over there. Where is he, Jeff?
I can't see it well enough.
Okay. He's on there. Where is he?
Your dad's here. I know he's there.
No, your dad's on here. Oh, over on the far end on the right.
Yep, on the far
On the right with the vest.
Up one more.
The
Right
vest.
there.
That's Jeff's dad.
Picture at the house.
Huh? You do, yeah. Yeah, and the names are actually, I'd say probably I know of at least about 4 or 5 people on that photo that are still living, but many of them have passed. They would be in the 88, 89, 87. But you go up a little bit, huh?
Where is King's School? Where did you say that was?
Glen Valley and Clearview.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go down from Shrewsbury, down Clearview, down the big hill, and go down, and there's a big sharp turn, and then head down, and it's another sharp turn. There's the old schoolhouse. That's King's. And then on that sharp turn there is the next thing. There was a grist mill there. It was a mill. They call it Bortner's Mill because that was the main proprietor that was there. It's actually Lucille and Eddie Wall. Mike Wall, who was our state senator, his parents live on that property now. But as you can see, and if you drive past, I just drove past tonight, one of those millstones is still sitting against the side of the bank. It's still, they preserved it. But it was quite and then this is my great-grandmother and something back in 1919, and you can see the corner of the mill. They think they tore it down about the time of the Depression. But it was strictly a grist mill, which means a flour mill. They would grind the flour and separate the hull from the grain, and then they grind the grain up into flour. And then the next one was the Snell. And how many of you, a couple months ago, I think last year, there was a presentation down at Glen Rock about Snell coverlets. And what in the 19th century, most communities had at least one man and sometimes women that made these on a loom. Have you ever seen people on a loom? Made these coverlets. Pretty much a lot of them were always red, white, and blue. are maybe green. And this one is actually preserved, hopefully for eternity, is at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. So it's neat to think that a part of Shrewsbury Township history is at the Smithsonian. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. Now he lived, there's the second farm, the next farm up from that was where my grandparents lived, Renee and Margaret Fritz. And Jacob Snell lived there in the mid-19th century. And then in 1875 or so, he wanted to not have to farm and stuff. He sold the farm to his son and he moved to Shrewsbury and continued to make coverlets, I think, up until he died in 1902. But anytime you see those, whether they're his or anyone else's, they're really beautiful works of art, really. And now this is the 1876 map of Shrewsbury Township. And you can see it's getting more crowded, isn't it? A lot more names on it. Businesses also in 1876 as opposed to 1860. In 1860, you had two towns or whatever. You had Strasburg or Shrewsbury, and you had Glenrock started in 1859. And then New Freedom, I think, was 1873 because they celebrated their centennial back in 1973. And I think just 2 years ago they celebrated, 150 years. And then Railroad, I forget the dates of that. But so that is showing pretty much what we still know as the areas. And these maps are really helpful, particularly if it was a landowner, you had an ancestor with a landowner, you might be able to find them. And then the other thing is, too, is if you can find like the census for 1870 or 1880, sometimes you can go down it, and they usually, when they were taking the census, they worked their way up one road and down the other. So that's a good way to try to find people that are ancestors. Okay, this is Henry K. Sechrist. This is my second great-grandfather and his little boy, and that's my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Strayer Sechrist. And it's interesting here on the census of 1870, Henry King is the farmer. That's down where King's Schoolhouse is. And then Jacob Strayer would have been the father of Nathaniel. That is sort of, he lived up the hill before you get to the Fritz farm. And then I guess Snell might have moved, or he didn't, maybe he skipped over him. But then the Sechrist farm, you had Henry and his wife Elizabeth and his son William H. And then they had his, I think it probably was a nephew that was working on the farm, and they had a domestic servant as well. And then his dad is down below. He was 61, and his wife was with him as well. And they had quite a nice farm. This picture is taken like right around the turn of the 20th century. This is Henry K. a little later in life. One thing I find fascinating with old photographs, speaking of which, are they laying somewhere? Or you have them in the back, I'll get them afterward. It was a pretty substantial brick farmhouse, little spring house. They had fence all around in front of it. And this is what makes me think he might have served. This is Decoration Day. We call it Memorial Day now. Yeah, and they were dressed and probably went out to Shrewsbury. They had ceremonies at the cemetery out there for the thing. Again, I judge this to be about 1891. One thing you do when you're looking at old pictures, you just kind of base it on, like, my great-grandfather Charles was born in 1885. Does he look like he's about 6 or 7 maybe in that picture, maybe a little older? So, I mean, that's sort of how I judge it. And his brother Harry was born, that's the one on the far right. But William, what about William out in Ohio? Was he poor all his life? No, he ended up pretty prosperous, actually. I don't have a picture of his farm on here, but he looks like a pretty fat and happy, person that has been able to make a good living. And but anyway, this building, I think it was torn down is when I remember, but this was probably part of the original farm. It was an old log house, and they used it for a storehouse. in the early 20th century. And then this is my grandmother, the great-grandmother that heard the guns at Gettysburg. You can see she lived from 1847 to 1920. And she's my favorite great-great-grandmother because she liked cats. And so, and a dog too. She was an animal lover. Yeah, she liked her cats and dogs. Can't be all bad. Here's a photo of the farm I took in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. What happened, I'm not going to go into too much, but my great aunt and my great uncles and my grandmother couldn't decide how to settle the estate, and they let it sit empty for like 30 years, which is frustrating as all get out, but I was too young. So anyway, then they finally settled it. My one great uncle got the farm, and then he said, well, the buildings are too rough to fix up, and ended up tearing everything away. Had Amish take it down like in the early 2000s. But the only thing that is still standing, and I just saw it today and stuff, is a little spring house. It's a stone-built spring house. It's really solid. Might have been one of the original things. Sits on a spring, and the water out of the spigot, it was some of the coolest, freshest water I ever drank. Now, when the animals were in the pasture on the other side of the spring, it may not have been that way. But, and then the barn I estimate might have been older than the house because it was a really neat weatherboarded barn that the whole back, you drove up around, and that's what I'm going to talk about. That was my great-grandfather there dressed to work. Looks like it was snow on the ground. You see many of these around yet, thank goodness. German barns. And they were very practical. They had the barn would come out over the front of the stalls. And so you could work in the wintertime underneath, not if it was pouring rain and stuff, you could at least feed the animals and have some protection. And then the stone sides, there's one out by Susquehanna going towards Bon Air that has beautiful stone sides like that are still standing. And then it almost, I have to laugh, it almost looks like a metal roof on there, on that drawing. That's what most of the farmers have on their farms. They used to have tin, but now they're doing metal roofs on the barn. And then finally, I have an 1895 Ram McNally Atlas that I picked up, and I took this picture out of there of the area of York and Adams County, and you can see that compared to 1770 to just over 125 years later, that now we're pretty much fully developed. You have road systems, you have railroads, and still had a way to go. My mom talks about even in the 40s, before they made some of the roads around here, Macadam, that in the springtime and winter, that they had cars, but they had to drive them on the rises that were made by the ruts of the wagons or whatever thing. And if you slipped down in the ditch, you were done. And then I worked at Geipel's furniture store for 5 years back in the 80s and 90s, and they still have an old hearse that they actually purchased in the 20th century. They purchased it in like 1905, but they were still using it up until 1940 because, again, some of the areas in Shrewsbury Township and Cadorus Township were so rustic yet, or else they were dirt roads. You might be a redneck if you start out, I grew up on a dirt road. And I can say that. But seriously, most of the time they kept it well graveled, and that was pretty good. But they can get, we don't, now it's not a problem. Everything's so dry. But anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I think I've given you a good glimpse into Shrewsbury Township history, because that's really where my heart lies. So, any questions, comments? Yes.
On one of those slides.
Go ahead. Here, go ahead. Wait a minute. Let her give you so people at home can hear. Obviously.
On one of those slides, the newspaper article from 1870, it mentioned the rich iron fields of northern Maryland, just south of here.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that's at. I need to do some research. Yeah, do you know?
Right below Loganville, there's copper mines down
Yeah, out by Seven Valleys or Loganville, there's copper, and then out by Seven Valleys, there's iron ore they did mine. But that did say Maryland, didn't it, or something?
That's what I thought, yeah.
I don't know, but I'm saying there are, Jerry, actually save that question for Jerry Jones. He's a geologist, he knows the land things and stuff.
At the end of the bike trail at Ashland, I think there was either a blast furnace or an iron ore mine.
And now you're talking about Ashland, Maryland?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ashland, Maryland on the North Central Railroad Rail Trail. Yeah, I do think there were some things with the this area around here is limestone in most areas, and then there is ore underneath the limestone and on the.
There is a iron ore mine by Hanover Junction.
Yeah, that's there's actually a county park now.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah, Joseph Robb County Park. When I was in college, we did a study of that because there was actually a group that wanted to come in and open it back up, and people in that community were very upset about it. They wanted to come in and do a whole industrial thing. It would have changed the dynamic of that whole area, so then they kind of shut it down. And but there's still ore in the ground, and also up in the Pigeon Hills and over towards Hanover. Like I say, Jerry, I don't want to take anything from him. He'll any geological thing he can answer because he has studied that. That's his specialty. Yeah. Any other? Well, thank you so much. Would you be interested if I put some other things together to hear again? Okay, thanks. I will working on a couple other angles, but I thought this one was kind of. And if you want to hear, I do have one on the Seitz Kleinfelder family. The Seitzes did a lot more so in this time period, but that's why we have Seitzland, we have Seitzville. I'm trying to think what else is Seitz. There's some other thing, but there were brothers. There were brothers that learned the milling trade down in West Liberty, down in Maryland, and then came up here and they had mills a bunch of different places. Michael Kay had a mill down from Fissel's Church. There were mills about every 2 to 5 miles about in that time period. They were sort of the hub of the community in the late 18th century, early 19th century, because you could grow your grain, but you needed to get it processed to be able to have flour and stuff to cook. And also it just was, it was a profitable thing. The one that I always have to laugh about is that they said they had at the mill, that Borton mill, when it first opened, somewhere I read that it was a flavin mill or a tanner mill. But the flavin is flax. And one of the things they would do to purify it or clean the flax is they would use urine, okay? And I'm thinking, well, what about the people down creek that go to Glen Rock and or whatever? But I think they predominantly, when they built the brick one, they made it a grist mill. If you're interested in that history, there's a whole book from Glen Rock about mills.
One more question.
Yeah.
A couple of the names that I saw in your presentation were Schweitzer and Seacrest. And those are cold meat products that you see in the grocery store, like the Seacrest hot dogs and the Schweitzer Lebanon bologna.
Yeah.
Are you heir to one of those fortunes?
I wish. Actually, my one great grandmother, I could be rich if all my family lines. I have Utzes in my background, but it's no relation. My one great grandmother was a Stroh, I thought I could have the chips and the beer, but anyway, the Seacrest way back, they all come from the same ancestor. The ones in Dallastown that do the Seacrest hot dogs, and I love them, but mine were particularly farmers. But my one family line, and I was thinking about putting something together on this, they were all butchers. Any of you remember Thomas and Deal in Glen Rock? Or Thomas's Meat Market down in Hungerford, Shrewsbury? Those were my great uncles on my mom's side. And I've thought about putting together a presentation about it. Might be a little gory, but we're all adults here. But we grew up butchering. I mean, that was just, they still do. Some of my cousins still do. They get together and they work at their farm, and it just was something that they started. All farmers used to do pretty much their own, but at the turn of the 20th century, some of the farmers didn't really have the skills or didn't want to do it. And my mom's family, the Thomases, they actually were itinerant butchers. They would go around in the wintertime and do process pigs and maybe a cow for the other farmers and get it down to the point where they could do, the curing or whatever. Maybe they did that too, but I grew up, the only job I could have, if any of you are familiar with butchering, I always laughed. I said the only job they gave me was to cut up the tallow, or like the fat on the back of the pig that you make into lard, because I couldn't mess it up too bad. It just needed to be cubed up so it could be melted down. Anything that involved cutting the meat, I might have cut it wrong, but my brother does it. I mean, it wasn't. I like doing this stuff. I'm not big with some of the hand stuff. Well, thank you for coming, and I thank you for listening.